All right, welcome everyone to the 11 o'clock session. I'm Derek Kavanaugh, and I'm here with introducing John Bates. John is author of 9 books and a contributor to 7 others, all focusing on the natural history of the Northwoods. He's worked as a naturalist in the Wisconsin Northwoods for 30 years, leading an array of trips, all designed to help people further understand the remarkable diversity and beauty of nature and our place in it. So John's going to be talking about the wild lakes of northern Wisconsin, some of the true gems of our state. So John, let's take it away.
All right. Thank you, Derek. Appreciate it very much. Thank you all for joining. I want to take you on a quick tour of some of the last wild undeveloped lakes in northern Wisconsin. And I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you. We don't have very many. And I've been spending the last 4 years trying to paddle as many of them as I can. And I'll tell you a little bit more of that as we go along. Next, please. I love this quote by Edward Hall. Relative to Zoom meetings, sitting still in confined places is one of the worst punishments that can be inflicted on the human species. So I will try to move this along and keep you entertained, if you will. Talking about wild lakes, and when we talk about wild lakes, the antithesis is below us. I don't know where this is in China, but good Lord, I feel so sorry for those people. We're so privileged and blessed in northern Wisconsin to still have some lakes that you can be the only person on all day long, and see what you're supposed to see. Be able to honor a lake as it truly is. Next. So when we think of wild lakes, we tend to think big. I tend to think of Lake Superior and or the Boundary Waters Canoe Area or Quetico. And of course, in Wisconsin, we can't compete whatsoever with Minnesota's Boundary Waters. Golly, over 1,100 lakes from 10 acres to 10,000 acres, most of which are connected by portage trail. So what do we have in Wisconsin? We'll get to that next. Next slide. We have 15,000 or so lakes in Wisconsin, all of which have stories. A place is a space with a story. And part of looking at all these wild lakes that are left in our state is to try to discover their stories. And frankly, I've had trouble finding a lot of the stories. I want to figure out where the names came from. I want to know the original Ojibwa names. And I'd love to know why they were saved while other ones often nearby weren't. So where I can, I've been trying to pull those stories together. Next. As almost all of you, I'm sure, know, most of our lakes in northern Wisconsin are glacial pothole kettle lakes, ice block depressions, ice cubes basically calving off the glacier as it was retreating. So most of our lakes are small and shallow. Good examples are Vilas and Oneida County, where over half of our lakes here are 10 acres or less, 88% of Oneida County. So 9 out of 10 lakes in Oneida County are less than 25 feet deep. So we have a lot of small, shallow lakes. We do, however, in Vilas County, I live in Iron County, right next to the border of Vilas. We do have one of the largest concentrations of lakes of kettle lakes in the world. 1,327 of them in Vilas County, about 16% of the land area in Vilas. There's another 17% or so that's wetland in Vilas. So about 1 out of every 3 steps you take in Vilas is going to squish. This is a globally important area, in particular in Vilas County, for these kettle lakes. Next. What's the definition of a lake? This is important when we get into this competition with Minnesota all the time. We say we have over 15,000 lakes. Minnesota, with its license plate, says it's the land of 10,000 lakes, but it really has 11,842. But the Minnesota definition of a lake is greater than 10 acres, whereas the Wisconsin definition is kind of anything that holds a little bit of water, basically an acre or more. So if you apply the Minnesota 10-acre definition to our lakes, we only have 5,898, and Minnesota beats our hind end pretty hard that way. 25-acre cutoff, Minnesota has far more than 2 times as many lakes as we do. We're down to 3,300 or so, and they're at 8,500 or so. So Minnesota wins the war of lake numbers. Nevertheless, in Wisconsin, we still have a lot of gorgeous, smaller and fewer wild lakes, but they're worth visiting. Next. Why focus on our wild lakes? I love this quote by Jack Turner in his thin but wonderful book, The Abstract Wild. He says, without the experience of qualities such as wildness, magic, spirit, and the sacred, we treat flora and fauna as resources and playgrounds. And I think that's true. When you're on a wild lake, on a lake that is fundamentally undisturbed for 10,000 years, at least undisturbed by much of humankind. Now, Native Americans may have been utilizing these sites, but I'm speaking more about post-settlement usage. Nevertheless, these lakes have a magic to them, have a, if you will, a sacredness to them, however you'd like to use that definition. And I like to think about James Kunstler's 1993 book, some of you may have read, called The Geography of Nowhere, where he talks so much about how in America things have become homogenized, how when you enter a small town, there's all these chain stores on either end and everything looks the same. It's this kind of cookie cutter stuff. Some of you may remember the old folk song by Malvina Reynolds, Little Boxes, speaking to just this homogenization of America. And Kunstler talks about how places have lost their souls because of all the development around them. And I think what we want, each of us wants to have is not to be nowhere, we want to be somewhere. We need to create a geography of somewhere, or to at least honor these places that are still somewhere. And that's what wild lakes are. They're still places that have their souls, and they're places that are unique and remarkable and thus worth visiting. Next. One of the easiest ways to differentiate an undeveloped lake from a developed lake is to look at a study done in 1997 by the DNR, comparing a lot of the northern lakes up here of similar size, similar geographical location. And so looking at plant life, this chart pretty much leads to everything else, which shows that undeveloped lakes have far more canopy, have far more understory, and far more shrub layer. And in particular on our developed lakes, people have left the high canopy layer because that doesn't necessarily impact their viewscape, but they've cut the understory species and the shrub species down to a very low amount, less than 10% plant cover on developed lakes. And that of course has some rather profound impacts on what happens on the surface of the lake, in the lake water itself, and all the animals, birds that are utilizing lake life via their predation. Next. So in that same study, they give an example of how this alteration of undeveloped lakes into developed lakes changes wildlife species. And they use the common green frog, the one that has that loose banjo twang. And they show that on an undeveloped lake per mile, you'll have 40 green frogs. And this kind of linear digression down to none when you get up to 30 homes per mile. And of course, now in Wisconsin, you can have a home every 100 feet. And so that's 52 homes per mile. So green frogs are out of luck as we develop lakes. Just one example of some of the differences that occur when we develop a lake. Next. Within that same study, again, they looked at birds on developed lakes and birds on undeveloped lakes. And what was interesting is the abundance of birds was the same. That fundamentally, the total numbers were the same. But what was different was the constellation of birds. So the birds in developed lakes are all wonderful birds. I like them all, pine cicadas and catbirds and orioles and so forth. Next slide. But if you look at the birds on wild lakes, it is a very different cadre. And most of these birds will be those who nest on the ground or in shrubs, or in high level of older trees, denser trees, maybe hemlocks and so forth, that would be less disturbed by some cutting along a shoreline. So while there is still an awful lot of birds on developed lakes, most people would not note the difference unless they were birders and were looking at specific species. The constellation of birds is quite different on a wild lake compared to a developed lake. Next. This talk comes out of the genesis of my writing a book on all these wild lakes. Over the last 4 years, I've paddled 75 of these undeveloped lakes up here. I've got about another 40 or so to look at. I'm cutting it off at 30 acres or more as the ones I want to look at, so that when you paddle, at least you're on the lake for more than 5 or 10 minutes poking around. And what I'm going to maybe say what's the 50 best and the 50 best of the rest. I don't know how that's all going to work out, but when I think about what's the best wild lake, I think of size, what are the largest lakes? What are the ones that have the greatest diversity and or rarity of species? What lakes have the greatest aquatic floral value? What lakes have the clearest water? What lakes have a surrounding landscape and watershed that is intact and not providing very much nutrient input into that lake because of it being so intact. So typically what I would consider a better lake would be one surrounded by a state natural area, for instance. Those lakes also that have limited recreational impact. We have a number of lakes, wild lakes in northern Wisconsin that do allow electric motors and a few that allow gas motors as well, which to me alters a bit of the wildness aspect. And in writing the book, I'm also trying to look at access. There's a number of lakes that are really, really hard to get to, unless you're a bit crazy and not as old as I am. And on the other hand, I don't want it to be too easy to get to. So it's this interesting balance of not too easy and not too hard. And just this very subjective look at the beauty of a lake. So when I come up with this 50 or 60 best that I'm going to come up with, those will be the criteria I'll be trying to utilize. Next. And just to get this out of the way right away, when I've gotten some blowback from a variety of people that I shouldn't be writing a book on the last wild lakes because they should be kept secret. First of all, most of those lakes you can find them. They're on plat books, as I'm doing, finding them on plat books or on various websites and or Google Maps. You can find all these on your own. But I really like this one quote: "No one ever washed a rental car," and that says to me, speaks very clearly to me about how we need to have ownership of places, and certainly not in a title sense of ownership, but ownership in terms of experience in places that lead us to love a place, that lead us to having a commitment to a place, a marriage to a place, such that we will protect that place. And so it's a trade-off. The book may well lead more people to some of these wild lakes. And the fear, of course, is that we love places to death sometimes. But the other side of the coin is those places are always in a state of endangerment via changing politics or whatever the case may be. So we protect what we love. So I'm hoping that in writing this book, that it'll have the right impact of having people cherish these last wild lakes rather than utilize them too much. Next. The book's going to be illustrated by a woman named Becca Jabs out of Manitowoc. She's doing these fabulous illustrations. I just wanted to throw those in there. So just because it's so cool, the work she does. Next. Another example of so the book hopefully will also add to ecological understandings of plants and animals that we would find on these wild lakes. Next. Enough about the book. Let's talk about the lakes. I've highlighted 14 lakes in 6 different counties out of the 75 I've been on so far. So it's kind of a random sample. Let's look in Ashland County at Mineral Lake. Interestingly enough, when you pull up a topo map, any topo map typically is not up to date. So on this particular topo map, it looks like there's still homes on this peninsula sticking down into the northern end of Mineral Lake. Those homes are no longer inhabited, though you can see one of them still from the lake, but my understanding is it's now all U.S. Forest Service land, and that campground to the far south has just been closed. So the lake itself is wild. However, there's a boat ramp, and people can put motorboats on this lake. So there's a lot of trade-offs, but it's a big lake, and this is unusual for wild lakes that are left in our state. To get anything over 100 acres is fairly unusual. So 29 feet deep is the max, 12 feet mean. Next. What's cool about this lake is the boulder shoreline on the north and eastern and western shores, a Canadian shield shoreline that we often don't see on a lot of our lakes, and struck me as really quite beautiful. It gave me more of a Canadian or at least northern Minnesota feel to Mineral Lake. Next. The Runzweiler River runs into this lake from the south and exits to the north. A beautiful little whitewater river if you want to not only paddle the lake, but then exercise some whitewater skills going down this little river. Next. What I was surprised at and when I paddle the shorelines of every lake very slowly, trying to look at all the flora. And this, out of all the lakes I've been on over these 4 years, this is the only lake that had purple fringed orchid on one of the shorelines. And just was quite shocked to see it, as it's a plant I rarely see. So it's one of the unique features of this particular lake. Next. Southern end of the lake is a wetland. And so I like that. I like having a variety of habitats around a lake that you can see different plant life in, and thus often a very different bird life and or mammal life. So I was being watched by a pair of eagles here at the south end of Mineral Lake as I was messing around in a lot of these water lilies and so forth. Next. Mineral Lake lies within the Brunswiler River and Mineral Lake State Natural Area, a 1,523 acre state natural area. Interesting enough, when you look at this map, it shows Mineral Lake being cut out of that. And I think that was because historically there was that peninsula with private property on it. Now I hope at some point that'll be redrawn and Mineral Lake will set within the entire state natural area. Next. Let's move into Bayfield County to the Potagotic Lake State Wildlife Management Area and Potagotic Lake, which is 532 acres. It's probably the largest wild lake left in the state, at least as far as I can figure from all the work I've done. It's also end-to-end wild rice. So it's the largest wild rice lake we have. Absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous lake, and rather easily accessed south of Cable. Next. We paddled here last fall, just late September after the rice harvest. You certainly don't want to paddle in a rice lake in August and into early September when the rice is ready to fall, because you don't want to knock the rice into the water if you're not going to collect it. But after the harvest is done, it's a great time to paddle. And here all the shorelines changed, leaves have changed. It was just a glorious, beautiful morning to paddle on this lake. Had it all to ourselves. And what a large, large lake. Next. Paddling through wild rice. Wild rice is a grass, so it's really like paddling through a prairie. It's like taking a walk through a tall grass prairie, but you're in a boat. And from a paddling standpoint, it's awkward. Your paddle is constantly whacking all these tall stalks of wild rice. Next. And so it's real nice when you can actually get an opening and have some ease of paddling. This is my wife ahead of me. She's been paddling a lot of these lakes with me. Always great to have a second set of eyes and another mind and heart to help interpret what we're seeing. Next. Muskrat houses abound. Waterfowl abound. We were kicking up ducks all over the joint on this lake. Just as a birding site, I would think it would be unparalleled in many ways for waterfowl in our state, being that large of a wild rice lake. Next. Let's move on to Perch Lake, also in Bayfield County. Perch Lake is right on the boundary of the Rainbow Lake Wilderness Area, about 6,600 acres of wilderness just to the west. Perch Lake has 2 campgrounds on it, and we camped in that northern campground. Only has 10 sites. So this is an interesting question of, do you call a wild lake, what's a wild lake? Can it have any kind of development? I'm kind of breaking it off as private ownership as the development that I will not allow to come within the definition of a wild lake. But if there's a campground, which is an impermanent site, and in this case, the campsites really can't be seen from the water, that helps me feel good about it still being a wild lake. Next. As you paddle the lake, it's rather small, 69 acres or so. There's an island on the south end that you can paddle around. Next. And a pair of trumpeter swans nest on this lake, and they were still there. And gosh, we were there in October now, paddling on this particular lake, and no chicks, unfortunately. But in this case, at least the adult pair were still there. Next. If you're not familiar with what a trumpeter swan nest looks like, it's big. It looks like kind of like a loon nest on steroids. It's just a whole lot of wetland material, in this case, right on the edge of an island. And like loons, trumpeter swans are going to nest right on the edge of the water, and preferably on the edge of an island where you're a little bit further away from any predation, or easy predation anyway, by mink or otters or raccoons, or a variety of animals who like bird eggs. Next. When you paddle the lake, folks can take their boats down to the shoreline and leave them there, though you can't really see the campsite. You might see the boats, and that, unfortunately, to me, is a little bit of a mark against this as a wild lake, because sometimes you will see somebody's boat along the shore, but that's being a little too purist, possibly. The fact that you can camp on this lake and take your boat directly down from a campsite is an upside. So lots of trade-offs in this world. This is just one. Next. Perch Lake is, as I said, right next to the Rainbow Lake Wilderness. So what I like to emphasize as well in the book will be other recreational opportunities wherever you are paddling. Where else can you paddle? Where can you hike? Where can you get on a bike trail, etc.? So in the Rainbow Lake Wilderness, Canard Lake in the south there is a beautiful little wild lake, a Wabagon Lake. Out of the wilderness area on a portage trail that's hard to find is a wild lake as well. Anderson Lake is another one, but it's a mile-long portage to get to. Clay Lake is a wild lake also. So anyway, there's a number of lakes within the wilderness that if you're willing to do some walking and portaging that you can get to. Makes going to Perch Lake all that more worth your time, because there's so much really close to you. Next. Let's move into Florence County to a lake called Savage Lake, which is about 10 miles west of the town of Florence, way up there on the Michigan border there. Savage Lake's a big lake from wild lake standards, 144 acres, but it's only 10-foot maximum. So this is a shallow bathtub of a lake. Next. With a lake on that map that I forgot to mention called Robago, just to the northeast, which is also another wild lake that you can access with about a half-mile portage, though. This is in the Pine Popple Wild Rivers Project, so if you want to paddle the Pine, it's just 2 miles to the north. And this is a wild area back in here. Hard to find this lake. It was a struggle for us, but once it's found, there's some signage once you get there, and there's a little parking area once you get there. So it's a carry-in of, I don't know, 75 yards, not too far to carry a boat down. Next. No specific put-ins, but here's where we found the spot along the shoreline amidst some very beautiful older hemlocks. A lot of the shoreline, I was surprised, had older growth characteristics, some big cedars, big hemlocks, some super canopy white pine. Here's my wife getting in. Next. And the lake's shallow, as I was mentioning. So you're really never out of water lilies, never out of aquatic plants. And I like that. I'm a plant nutcase. I love seeing all these aquatic plants. So I enjoy this. This is not a lake you're going to go swimming in. It's a lot of muck on the bottom. It's also, though, a fabulous waterfowl lake. We kicked up numerous flocks of ducks as we were paddling around. Next. And when you get on one of these shallow lakes, you tend to see these rhizomes of white and yellow water lilies floating to the top, because beaver and muskrat really like to eat those things. A lot of folks don't know what that is. It kind of looks like a softball bat. They're big things, laying on the surface, but that's just the rhizomal structures of white and water lilies. And those rhizomes can be very old, up to a century old. These clonal colonies of lilies can be old growth. So not only do you look to pines and hemlocks to be really old, but you can look to some of these clonal aquatic plant colonies. Next. Great site for waterfowl, wood ducks, and hooded mergansers. I didn't see green herons on this lake, but I would think it would be a great site for green herons. Next. Grandma Lake, also in Florence County. Love to know why it's Grandma Lake. Whose grandma are we talking about here? Somebody named these things back when, and hope to find out grandma who at some point. So this is a carry-in lake. Oh gosh, a quarter mile or so you got to carry in on a little portage trail that it's not being maintained, so lots of blowdown on it. You'll note that this lake is 9 foot maximum deep. So this is another one of these wetland lakes. Next. What's cool about it is it's a state natural area, 475 acres. Next. And it's also a research natural area, which is a designation the U.S. Forest Service gives to far fewer areas than what we categorize as state natural areas. So it's 495 acres in this case. And what they say in the first sentence is what you need to know. It's notable for a pristine, undeveloped bog lake and a surrounding open mat composed primarily of sphagnum moss, sedges, rushes, and low ericaceous shrubs that support a flora that's both diverse and unusual. Really a pretty place. Next. Here's the put in, which is not so unusual for some of these wild lakes. So in this case, you have to walk across a bog mat, I don't know, 40 yards or so to get to the actual water. So wear some rubber boots or tennies or just go barefoot. That works. Next. And when you put in, you'll be surrounded by this fabulous ericaceous bog mat, all kinds of bog plants that, to me, enrich the experience to paddle along slowly along these shorelands and enjoy what is fundamentally undisturbed for 10,000 plus years. You can't beat that when you think about it. That's, you know, how long have these plants been here? What are the changes they've undergone? Just trying to dream your way into the life of that lake and be very present for whatever it may offer you. This is a very cool lake to paddle. Next. Going to Florence County, here's McKinley Lake. McKinley Lake is just south of the Franklin Lake, Butternut Lake campground. So there's a campground nearby. McKinley Lake actually has a single campsite on it, right? That's a drive-in site that you can then carry up to. Bowes Lake just to the east has one house on it. Three Johns Lake just to the west has 3 houses or so on it. There's a bunch of other wilderness lakes around her, wild lakes around her. McKinley Lake's small, 48 acres. It's a relatively rapid paddle. If you paddle fast, for me, I took it real slow. Next. And I took it real slow because of the floristic value. Here is the put in. Next. What was really so lovely about McKinley Lake were the number of logs, old trees fallen into the water that had been colonized over who knows how long by sphagnum moss, and then been colonized by the plants that colonize sphagnum moss, typically in a bog. So these are bog logs, and on these logs, and there were numerous of them all around this lake, fabulous sites for sundew. And I don't know if you can see all the sundew on this log, all the flower structures. Just I missed by a week the flowers in bloom. This was mid-July when I was paddling. But floristically, this was as pretty a lake as I've been on in the search for all these wild lakes. Next. So a close-up of sundew, if you're not familiar with it. It's a carnivorous plant, sticky little water droplets, viscous droplets at the very tip of all those rays coming out from the sun-like disk of sundew. This was the original fly paper. I've read historic accounts where Native Americans would actually pick this plant and hang it in wigwams and catch flies and mosquitoes. It would work fine. So anyway, this plant does close over very slowly over whatever it captures, hopefully lots of mosquitoes, and slowly digest them. Just a beautiful little carnivorous plant. Next. Some other plants that I saw along the shoreline on McKinley were pipewort. Pipewort looks like these little candies we ate when we were kids. Some of you are old. You probably will remember those candies. They were called non-parallel or parallel or some darn thing chocolates. So they had this little white kind of coating on top and little chocolate underneath. They always remind me of that. This is a sterile rosette plant. I mean, it's a plant that only grows, these are the kind of plants anyway, sterile rosettes that only grow in very clear, pure waters. So when you see these, they're indicator species to say you've got a really healthy lake. Next. Got in at the very end of very good blooming of rose begonia orchids. This is mid-July. You need to go more like the 1st of July to hit the bloom quite right. This is on the north end of the lake. Next. And just a few other plants, steeplebush and monkey flower. It just was a riot of aquatic flowers all the way around the outskirts of shorelines of McKinley Lake. So if you're a plant flora lover, check out McKinley Lake. Next. And what's also cool about McKinley Lake, you see it there in the right-hand upper corner, McKinley, is that there's a trail called the Hidden Lakes Trail, 13 miles long, that runs right between McKinley and Three Johns and takes you along Franklin and over down to Perch Lake, which is a state natural area. Then you head over to White Deer Lake, which is a wild lake, and Luna Lake, which is another wild lake. Anyway, it's just one of the best hiking trails in the North Woods of Wisconsin. I don't think is utilized too much. We've led a number of trips on this trail over the years. Highly recommend it. So not only do you get to paddle a bunch of great lakes, wonderful wild lakes, but you get to do some wonderful hiking as well. Next. Lake Laura, also in Forest County, with Lake Gordon, which is 51 acres or so just to the west of it, also a wild lake. Lake Laura has a campground on the south end where we camped in October. But a 2.5 mile trail goes all the way around the outside of Lake Laura, so you can hike along the edge, and certainly you can paddle this lake. And Lake Gordon is easily accessed as well to paddle. So it's nice to have two wild lakes right next to each other. Next. There's a big pier that goes out in the lake. So this is one of the lakes that allows electric motors, not gas motors, but electric. And so just standing on the pier could look at a loon feeding a chicken dove at just that moment, of course, when I was trying to get them both in the photo. Next. Hiking trail, in particular along the north and the eastern end, it's beautifully clothed with old hemlocks, just a great trail. So loved paddling the lake, but then the next day being able to get out and hike all around it. There's a mountain bike trail nearby as well. It's a great recreational site in general. Next. There's a bog lake on the far northeastern end off the trail that you can walk out onto a little boardwalk. And if you had your kayak along with you or canoe, you could pop in there and look at all the bog vegetation. You can tell it's October. Here's Mary with her down jacket on. It was a little chilly. Low 50s that particular day we were there. Next. Some super canopy white pine and hemlock all along the shore. Next. And for the most part, the campground's not visible for the lake, but there are some campsites that are. And here's where we were camping. We bought a camper last August just because trying to get to all these lakes and spend time in an area and not be driving back and forth endlessly gave us the fabulous excuse to finally buy the camper we've been dreaming about forever. So anyway, we're having a lot of fun exploring northern Wisconsin and trying to find all these little lakes that are still undeveloped. Next. Real quickly, wild lakes differ naturally. We'll get back to some other lakes quickly as well, but part of the book will be discussing this. You can be on lakes that are right next door to each other, and they can be very different in the aquatic flora, in the bird life, in the mammal life that may be on them. They can just be in the water quality. Sometimes it can be super clear and 100 yards away, you've got an algal bloom on a different lake. So interesting. So there's a whole series of factors. And here's just some general ideas. I'm going to go through a few of them with you of why wild lakes differ naturally, even though they might be right next to each other in the exact same geographical location, same precipitation. Everything's the same except for these other factors. Next. One of the, I think, most interesting factors is just thinking about the elevation of a given lake. Trout Lake Limnology Station in Boulder Junction near us has invested quite a bit of time in thinking into position in a landscape and how important it is for a lake to be at the top of the sandbox and not at the bottom of the sandbox. So if you think about tilting a sandbox up on edge at 45 degrees and think of the lake at the highest end of the sandbox versus the one at the lowest, you're going to have all this groundwater input from top down to the lower. And those lakes at the very top, those are the seepage lakes. Typically, they're smaller, they're clear because almost all of the input of water is from precipitation and maybe some seepage from the surrounding landscape, but not from any downflow of nutrients coming through the soil. So Where you are in the sandbox really matters. And I think some of our most beautiful lakes are those at the top of the landscape. I'm in the Northern Highlands State Forest in a headwaters region. So we're up about 1,650 feet or so, which is about the height of land, up to 1,700 or so. This gets to be about the total height in northern Wisconsin. So those lakes that are at the top will be significantly different than a lake, even if it's 100 yards away, but lower in the landscape, maybe only 5 feet lower in elevation, but it gets groundwater input, bringing in quite a number of nutrients that you wouldn't find in the upper lake. Next. The watershed that you're in matters. I'm in the Manitoush River watershed in the little town of Manitoush on the Manitoush River. And it's a 268 square mile watershed with almost no homes, almost no farms. Vilas County is the worst farming county in the state, which I think is fabulous. We have the least number of farms, which means the least number of nutrient inputs from poorly managed farms. So, and we have such sandy soil and such a long winter that it makes for some very clear and beautiful lakes in this north central area of Wisconsin. So watershed quality matters hugely, the topography of it, the size of the watershed, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of factors in there, but it's something to look at and why one lake will vary compared to another. Next. The soil matters hugely. Where we are in Vilas and Oneida here and a little bit into Iron is that light yellow is H. And if you look over in your key, it says forested sandy soils. The glacier left us a huge pile of sand here in north central Wisconsin. Same is true in far northwestern and far northeastern. And sand doesn't have much in the way of nutrients. So when rainfall comes through, percolates through that sand into our lakes and our rivers, not a whole lot of nutrient outflow from those sources. And again, improves water quality. And as you look at different soils further south that are more fertile and therefore grow a whole lot more things than we grow up here, which is great. We need that. They also, though, put a lot of those nutrients into the lakes, and those lakes show those impacts via aquatic plant growth. Next. The lake shape matters too. So here's Crystal Lake near Boulder Junction, the swimming mecca of the Northwoods up here, 93 acres, almost perfectly round. And there's little Canard Lake over in the Rainbow Wilderness area, 33 acres. I haven't measured it, but I'd venture that the actual amount of shoreline in both lakes is very similar, even though Crystal Lake is almost 3 times as big in surface area. But because Canard Lake is so in and out with little bays and so forth, it has a lot more shoreline. The more shoreline you have, the more nutrient input you're going to get from the landscape around you. So the shape of the lake matters in terms of what will be the aquatic life within the lake. Next. Simple concepts. This one's not so, it's simple too, but it wasn't simple to me until I heard about it. I love this. There was a study and project done down in Lake Mendota in Madison to try to clear the lake via using predator fish. So what they did was they released over 12 years, over 2 million walleye and 170,000 northern pike. It was a biomanipulation experiment. And the idea is that predator fish eat prey fish, right? So the more predators you have, the fewer prey fish you're going to end up with. Well, the prey fish eat zooplankton. So if you have a lower population of prey fish, you're going to have a much higher population of zooplankton because there aren't enough fish to eat the zooplankton. Zooplankton eat the phytoplankton. So if you have a high population of zooplankton, you're going to have reduced the phytoplankton. Algae is one of those species of phytoplankton. So what they found is it worked. By increasing the number of predator fish, they actually cleared up the water in Lake Mendota for a while. A couple things happened though, is that fishermen, anglers found out about all of these walleye and went in there and hammered them. But then the spiny water flea got into Lake Mendota as well, and the spiny water flea feeds on Daphnia, and Daphnia is a zooplankton. So reduce the number of zooplankton by doing that. Great. And the Daphnia graze on algae. So actually the phytoplankton ended up going up. So ultimately it decreased the water clarity by 3 feet. So the best laid plans of mice and men sometimes goes to hell in a handbasket pretty quick, and that's what happened here. Some unanticipated factors entered in towards the end, but the fact that more predator fish actually can create a greater water clarity is something that a lot of folks don't consider. Next. Back to some lakes, Moose Lake in Iron County. We're now in Iron County, not too far from me, 15 miles or so away. Big lake for a wild lake, but again, very shallow, which is probably why it got protected. On the topo map, you see some houses on the eastern shore. Those are now all gone. You have to take a really potholed, lousy dirt road to get to good old Moose Lake. And there's a little connecting creek that takes you down to Little Moose Lake. It's just a little 13-acre, but wild, really beautiful little lake that you can connect into. Next. So Moose Lake, by the way, does have some moose in the general area. It's also a state natural area. Next. And a rather large state natural area, 4,293 acres, with some of our best old growth hemlock hardwoods scattered around in the southern areas of the state natural area. If you're not familiar with state natural areas, we've got 683 or so in the state, nearly 400,000 acres protected, for the most part protected, though that can still be managed within the state natural areas. Just go on to Wisconsin State Natural Areas website. Just Google that and you'll get maps of every one of these 683 state natural areas, and you can spend the rest of your life quite gloriously and pleasurably exploring all these various sites. Next. As you paddle around Moose Lake, it's a lot of wetland around the edges. I don't know if you noticed that in the map. Pickerelweed's quite common. Hopefully everyone knows this particular plant, clonal. Very hard to pull out of the sediments, holding the sediments together, slowing down wave erosion along shorelines, as do all of these aquatic plants. So they create these physical characteristics that really contribute to keeping our lake shores from eroding. It's a beautiful plant besides. Next. Battled this with a good friend, Chips Paulson, and what we noticed all around the lakeshore was how it was a lot of wetland swamplands as it were, but an awful lot of trees dying. Lake water levels, as people have spoken about in this conference already, have been super high the last 3 or 4 years, just incredibly high throughout all of 2020 when I was paddling, 3 or 4 feet higher than a lot of what looked like at least the lower lake levels that may have been experienced in the early 2000s. So a lot of shorelines are drowned, and on this particular lake, dozens and dozens of white cedar trees dead, I assume for being inundated for too long by high water levels. Next. Trumpeter swan flock, I don't know if they nest on the lake. Paddled it twice last year, but never noticed specifically a pair or any cygnets. Next. Brings us to Frog Lake in southern Iron County, just a half mile away from where Mary and I live in Manitowish. So this is our backyard. Frog Lake is a small little lake, 42 acres, but deep, 45 feet deep and max. And it's within the Frog Lake and Pine State Natural Area, 1,290 acres. And a seepage lake, so it doesn't connect to the Manitowish River, but there's the Manitowish River just a half mile to the north. Next. Purple bladderwort is the species of a keynote species to my mind of this particular lake. If you put in right around July 1st, there will be thousands of this carnivorous plant, little carnivorous plant, purple bladderwort in flower, right at the very muddy put in for this wild lake of Frog Lake. Next. Also want to point out just how beautiful some of these lakes are in the winter. It's one thing, of course, to paddle them in the spring, summer, and fall, but we do have this thing called winter, which lasts 5 months up here. So we spend a lot of time at Frog Lake snowshoeing. Next. And we snowshoe not only out on the lake shore itself, but along the edges of this particular lake is some very fine old growth white and red pine. What's cool about the one on the left, the red pine on the left, is the DNR, a researcher came along and took a tree cookie out of the base. You can see on the right side of that red pine and down at the bottom, a gap where the researcher cut out a tree cookie, and thus to age this tree, but also to look at fire scars. This was the point of the study. And you see that big fire scar on the red pine. And he found that the red pine began life in 1804, so this is a 217-year-old red pine. But I thought more interestingly yet, he found that the fire scars every decade from 1830 to 1890. Could these be natural fires? Unlikely. Almost certainly were being set by the native Ojibwa, who like the Flambeau Reservation is just down the road from us on Highway 47. Likely keeping this area burned for the values of blueberries and strawberries and blackberries, but also as a good place to hunt, opening up the sight lanes and the regrowth of vegetation. Fire was being used in the Northwoods, not as much as in the southern counties, of course, but used quite a bit. Native Americans used fire a lot more than I think people think about for the North Country. Next. Frog Lake lies within what was called not too long ago the Manfish River Wilderness. The DNR has changed the designation to scenic area or some such thing. So there's a bunch of other wild lakes around. Sherman Lake down there to the far southeast, Sandy Beach and Mud Lake there to the east. Just to the northeast is Plunkett Lake. And if you want to really have a wilderness experience, tromp through all the bog to get to Brush Lake and Kelly Lake and Woodson Lake, and there's another lake in there as well that are all wild lakes. So this area is dense with wild lakes. Plus you get to paddle the Manitowish River, which takes you down to the Bear River, which becomes the North Fork of the Flambeau, which flows into the Turtle Flambeau Flowage. So we live, I think, in one of the best places on the Wisconsin planet anyway. So come paddle frog. Next. I see I got 10 minutes to go, so I better get moving. Oneida County, Canard Lake, small lake that flows up into Sweeney Lake, which is a large, also wild lake, but very different in water quality from Canard. Next. Sweeney's an algae-rich lake. Canard is super clear. Lots of beautiful white water lily colonies. Next. Hopefully you've all smelled one. Lean over your canoe without falling out and stick your nose in one of those. It smells like fresh oranges to me. Just a glorious smell. Next. Bought a camera to do some underwater photography, mostly get blurred, useless images, but here's one of the prettier ones I've gotten. Looking at that particular white water lily colony from a foot deep in the water. Next. Canard Lake has a really lovely aquatic plant community. Musky weed is common, and nice to be able to get some pictures underwater just by leaning over my canoe with my camera and picking up some fish utilizing musky weed. This is also called largeleaf pondweed, and I really object to the word weed. A weed's a plant without a press agent. We need to find a way to rename some of these plants so they're not given that value-laden term of a weed. Next. Rose begonias are in flower, and a little bog to the north of Canard. Again, early July is when to see those. Next. McDonald Lake in Oneida County, a large, very shallow lake, 9 feet max, 4 foot mean, easily accessed. Next. Here we are putting in. Next. On the north shore is a plant that I don't see very often, water willow, or something called swamp loosestrife, that vegetatively reproduces by kind of tipping over, and the tip of the plant then roots into the soil, and up comes a new one, and it kind of almost is like wave action as it vegetatively twines its way, as it were, along the shoreline, and it produces these beautiful rose purpley flowers. Next. McDonald Lake is the lake that I know in our area to see northern water snakes. If you don't like northern water snakes, probably not a great place to paddle because they're fairly common within the water system here. Shallow lake, easily seen, and a large snake, 3 to 4 feet typically, and aggressive if you get too close and mess with them, but otherwise just fun to see. Next. Couple lakes in Vilas County and we'll be done. Aurora Lake, 4 foot maximum depth, tells you all you need to know. Next. Absolutely great wild rice lake. Here's the put in. Ordinarily, you can't even see the water. This was last year when we had such high waters that the wild rice year was very poor. Wild rice doesn't do well when the water levels get too high as general rule. Next. But still, there was some wild rice on the southern end of the lake. just coming up. So this was, oh gosh, late July, early August that I was paddling. Next. Great site. All these wild rice lakes are great sites for birds, from black terns to sorrel rails to ring-necked ducks. Just fabulous places for waterfowl and birds who love wild rice. Wild rice not only feeds human beings, it feeds a lot of birds. Next. If you're not familiar with the flowers, it's the male flower. That's the pretty one on the bottom of the plant. At the top of the plant, you see on the left side here, you see these little tiny feathery like white flowers. That's the female flowers. So the male flowers, pollen flies out horizontally. It's wind pollinated species to the side, so it doesn't self-pollinate and produces then those seeds from the female flowers adjacent to it later into late August and early September. Next. So when you're paddling Aurora Lake, you're rarely out of any plants. You're just kind of pushing your way through all these aquatic plants. And again, you better be a person that loves flora, because that's what you're going to see on this absolutely wild and beautiful wild rice lake. Next. Bittersweet Lakes is one of the few areas in Wisconsin where we actually had the foresight to connect some lakes via portage trails. There's 4 lakes here, 3 of which are in the 30 to 50 acre size. Bittersweet Lake there is 100 acres or more. Next. And this is a site near Woodruff, so just Minocqua Woodruff on Highway 70, so I don't know, 5 miles east of there. And just lovely put in sites, easy, very short portage trails with some campsites on each one of the lakes. Next. Common loons nesting on probably all 4 of the lakes. I'm not exactly sure, but I saw them on all 4. Next. Again, just another portage trail, campsites along the way. Next. And another, just an idea of how pretty each one of the put-ins and portage trails are. Next. This is the last lake I want to talk about, and then happy to answer any questions or hear better stories, better jokes, whatever you may have to offer. This is Frank Lake, and what I think is interesting about this particular lake is it's large by wild lake standards, 147 acres, and look at the map. The entire shoreland, except for a little piece in the northeast, is uplands. That is a rare commodity for wild lakes because these are the lakes that got developed the soonest with the beautiful upland pines. This is a sandy lake, 70% sand. It is a gorgeous kind of symbolic, what we think of as beautiful Northwoods lakes. This is it. Somehow it got saved. Next. Named Frank Lake because of this little plaque that's bored into this boulder along the lake that talks about Frank Long, who was a ranger and game warden back in the early 20s and who died in 1937 while on duty in the snowshoes in this particular area, the Star Lake area. I think that's neat. I would love to see this kind of thing happen for all the wild lakes around our area where there's some historic marker saying, okay, why is this lake called this? Somebody named it this way for a reason. It just helps your enjoyment, helps your appreciation of the site. Next. Just my daughter, in this case, Callie, paddling this beautiful lake with me. Next. Here we are, pulled up on an island in Frank Lake, having a picnic in the afternoon. Tough life I'm leading, looking at all these lakes. Next. So let's end here. We only grieve for what we know. My task in doing this book and in giving talks like this, and all of you who are engaged in this work, is to help people know the natural world so they can fall more deeply in love with it. And by falling in love, we will protect these places. So it's this is no short course to learning all this stuff. That's what I like, is the fact that I'm so ignorant about so much, yet even being this old, it's always a discovery, always a Sherlock Holmes effort to try to discover, be a detective to what's really going on in these lakes. Next. So I'll end with this quote by Peter Steinhardt. What we see in lakes depends much on what we bring to the shore, King Arthur's sword or the Loch Ness monster. Hopefully most of us bring King Arthur's sword. We come there with the idea of something pristine that we want to honor versus fear and development kinds of thoughts in our head of how can we take advantage of this place. Rather, I'd like to say, how can we fit in? How can we be a part of it? So I'm done. Throw it back to the moderator and see what questions and or comments we might have.
All right, thank you, John. If you have any questions, I've got a few here in the Q&A. Make sure you put it in that tab. And I wanted to thank John for one reason. I came from Minnesota, lived 20 years there and 23 years here. Spent a lot of time in the Boundary Waters, so it's nice to see these gems highlighted here in Wisconsin. I'm gonna make a point to get to one, but I really appreciate that he straightened out the lake debacle between which state has more lakes.
Yeah.
It's a battle I have to argue all the time, so he laid it out very nicely. But
Yep, much to our chagrin. Yep.
And I do like the statement he started with about a place being a space with a story or a meaning. And of course, he's got all his books here. If you go to his presenter page and click on his name on the link for this presentation, you'll also see the link to his books and stuff there too. There's just a .com missing on this screen, but other than that, the question we have here, have you come across any moose or moose signs in your travels, John, on these lakes?
Yes, so moose are seen just about every year in the last 20 years somewhere in northern Wisconsin. We have a pair of moose here in the Manitoush area leading down into Powell Marsh, if you're familiar with that, that have moose have young every 2 years, that have had calves. During this period, I did not see any moose last year, and so I was worried about that. So hopefully they're still here, but there is a pair that are clearly having calves rather seemingly consistently in the Manitoush area, and we're in southern Iron County. Douglas County would be probably the best place because of moose coming down out of Minnesota and venturing through there. But we're at the very southernmost edge of the moose range, and with climate change, they're just going to keep moving north. So what little we have today is not going to probably be here in the next few decades.
I think I recall either last year or two, one pair came wandering through the Eau Claire area of the state,
right?
I recall. But
cool.
What precautions do you take to prevent cross-contamination between your lakes? Do you clean your boats, and how?
Well, yeah, I guess we just pull our boats out and look at the bottom and sponge them off. It's about the only option we have. So yes, those are our precautions. But interestingly enough, most of these wild lakes, one of the criteria I'm going to have for everything in the book will be this formulaic thing. Every page will say XXX about it, every single lake, but one of the things will be invasive species. And the vast majority of these lakes that I've been on do not have invasive species on, at least that I've been able to see. That doesn't mean anything. Of course, you can have small spiny water fleas and so forth that you won't see. But anyway, those are the precautions we take.
So John, from your talk today, which of your books contains the information pertinent to this topic?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Of the books that you've published, what
Yeah.
one contains the ones with these lakes or at least similar topics?
Well, the River Life book that I published, gosh, 20 years ago now, talks a lot about ecology of rivers, and of course, rivers flow into lakes. So that would be the book that would have the most information, and it has a lot of information about river and lake ecology. The book, unfortunately, is out of print, so you'd have to find it used. That would be the one.
Check your local library. I was checking while you were talking here, and my local library has several of your books. So
great.
Then let me see here. If you remember back, the first lake you showed in Florence County during this presentation, do you recall what the name of that lake was?
Florence. Was it Savage? I think it was Savage that I showed in Florence.
And I don't have the answer. It wasn't a trivia question.
Well, and you don't want to depend on my memory for anything. You get in deep trouble.
You've been through a lot of lakes, so also this
presentation
isn't Savage. Okay, this presentation will be recorded and available too, so people can go back and review some of the great information that you put out there. So other than that, we are at time, and I thank you and all of our attendees for today's presentation.
Thanks, Derek. Appreciate it.